Well, joining me now to talk about this is Nick Stokes, whose wife died nearly a year ago due to secondary breast cancer. Nick, also a former NHS Trust chair, so someone that knows the National Health Service from the inside. And Nick joins me now. Good evening, Nick.
Good evening.
Are you shocked by the Ockenden report into what happened at Shrewsbury and Telford?
To be honest, I'm not at all shocked by many of the reports that are now coming out. And indeed, the research you quoted, I think the drop in interest, in people's views about GPs is dramatic. I mean, it's something like halved from pre-COVID and the pre-pandemic. And it's not surprising because we went through this situation that the NHS adopted and GPs adopted what they called a total triage, or otherwise known as telemedicine, which essentially meant that instead of seeing patients, they said, no, we'll just rely on reception staff to determine whether or not we should speak to you or not, and then we'll rely on telephone calls and we'll rely on videos and so on. And in the case of my wife, that was a complete disaster and led to her death.
Nick, I've had GPs on this show argue with me that actually an online, a Zoom consultation and diagnosis actually suits many patients and that it leads to few errors. Just share, if you would, briefly with me, Nick, the experience with your wife.
Yes, certainly. I mean, she was 69. She was a very active ex-PE teacher, played golf 3 times a week and so on. And she had breast cancer in the past, back in 2006, and had a mastectomy, but had recovered brilliantly from that. She was extremely in good health, but during the summer of 2020, she started getting pains in her leg and in her hip, which by September we were trying to get to see a GP. And at that point, we encountered telemedicine, which meant essentially that we had to queue for many minutes to try and even get through on the phone in the first place. Eventually, you might then say, well, I'll get a GP to ring you. And they rang her and said, oh, well, your age, what do you expect? You've got arthritis. Go and see a physio. And self-diagnose yourself to a physio, which was equally useless because, of course, physios weren't seeing patients either, not in the NHS anyway. So they just sent exercises and they were just as feeble. I mean, we did then try private physio who would see patients. And they actually recommended that we need to go back to our GP and ask for an X-ray or a scan. Yeah. But even after that, the practice still insisted that that wasn't necessary. They wouldn't see her, and her condition worsened to the point she could no longer walk, could no longer drive a car, and so on. In January 20, a year ago, just over a year ago, I eventually literally went to the surgery to demand painkillers and wouldn't leave until I got an appointment with a GP. And when he saw, of course, we went into diagnosis mode very quickly. They discovered she had very high calcium in the blood, rushed to hospital, major operations to try and repair the damage to her bones. But she was too weak to really fight the cancer, and she died within 3 months. And what really saddened me more than anything was 2 things. One, during that period of time, she was very rarely at home, and I couldn't see her in hospital because obviously of COVID, so she was stuck on her own. And I hate to think what was going through her mind in the last weeks. And secondly, after she died, the cancer specialist said to me, it was such a shame, if we'd seen her earlier, we could have treated her while she was strong enough. And although the cancer wasn't curable, it was controllable. But obviously it spread eventually to the brain, caused damage to her thinking and hearing, and she died in April a year ago.
In some ways, Nick, the saddest part of your story, and you explaining it to us here on GB News, is that you're far from on your own. There are so many of these stories that we're going to hear over the course of the next couple of years.